What's going on, everyone? DSP here, and mixing it up a little bit today. Basically, I never really do anything like this on my Street Fighter channel here on YouTube. Usually, as you know, it's just gameplay footage and stuff like that. But there's a topic near and dear to my heart, and near and dear to my chest right now because I'm wearing the shirt. But that I want to talk about a little bit. As you know, I am a pro Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo player. There was a period of time when I was traveling the country a lot to play that game on different console versions and such, and I am still really good at the game. I haven't really been, too much into playing it in tournaments. I did enter a couple tournaments this year. But anyway, I digress. That's not what we're here to talk about today. What we're here to talk about today is I was killing a little bit of time, relaxing, and every once in a while, once in a blue moon, I'll go on Shoryuken.com and on their forums. And I only go to a couple different places. There's only a couple topics that I'm really interested in. And I happened to see this thread today that said, why didn't HDR, which stands for HD Remix, and what that means is there was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix, which was released in 2008 on Xbox Live and PSN. But the topic was, why didn't that game catch on? Why is it that right now that game is no longer being held in a tournament setting anymore? And what happened? As you know, if you follow me and my channels, there is kind of an arcade Super Turbo revival right now across the United States. Most of the major EVO qualifiers this year, including East Coast Throwdown that's going on right now, including Midwest Championships going on right now, all have arcade Super Turbo and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix, or HDR as I'll refer to it for the rest of this video, isn't being played in a tournament setting anymore. And it's a valid question. What happened for outsiders who might be interested? Why, when you had a new remixed version of a classic game like that seemed to have everything going for it and all the tools going for it, why didn't it succeed in a tournament setting? This is a very controversial topic. There have been a lot of fights. There's been a lot of negativity going back and forth between different groups regarding this topic. And I made a post about it in the thread, but I said, you know what, this is something that's worth talking about in a public setting and opening it up to the public, especially the people who watch my Street Fighter channel. I think this is something that people might want to discuss. So, for the first time in a long time, I actually have an amazing amount of notes here of what I put in my post, and I'm basically just going to kind of read this to explain my feelings on the subject of what really happened. Now, to give you a little bit of background, Super Turbo, as everyone calls Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo for short, came out in the 1990s, and it was the very last version of Street Fighter 2 that was ever released in arcades. After that, they moved on to other series like the Alpha series, Street Fighter 3, and so forth. And the game, to a lot of people, they still believe this is the most balanced Street Fighter game ever made in history. It's still viewed as a very tournament-worthy game, and that's why I think there's kind of a revival of the arcade version of that game right now. It is, as of right now, it is the longest-running tournament game, fighting game, ever. I mean, no other fighting game that came before Street Fighter 2 is still being played in a competitive setting, okay? And in 2000, well, let's really put this in perspective. Back in like 2006, it was announced that there was going to be a remixed version of this game that was going to come out on Xbox Live and PlayStation Network, and it was supposed to solve the problem of being able to play this game in a tournament format. And let me explain what that means. There have been many console ports of Super Turbo, but none of them have ever been 100% accurate when it came to gameplay. Some of them had speed issues, some of them had input lag. You press the button, it would take way too long for your character to react, and obviously in a tournament setting that kills the game. Some of them had really essential gameplay changes, like certain characters wouldn't play the same way that they played in the original arcade version, and so no one was really pleased with any console release of Super Turbo up to that point. And so David Sirlin, who was a pro Super Turbo player in the 90s and continued to be to that day, was working with a company called Backbone Entertainment and was developing a remixed version of this game, Super Turbo, which would have new artwork, in high definition, remixed music, remixed gameplay. He was going to rebalance the game to try to make it perfect, basically. Fix the problems, make certain characters who were weak stronger, make some of the characters who people viewed as overpowered weaker, and try to make a fully balanced game. And the game was supposed to come out in the fall of 2007. Unfortunately, the development studio had some problems. They were primarily the problem was the artwork, trying to take this, 16-bit pixely artwork and turn it into an HD sprite. They had a studio working on it, basically a comic book studio working on it, and eventually they just dropped it because they were taking too long, there were too many delays, the artwork, the fan feedback was horrible. They said, this doesn't look good, we don't like the look of this game. So it was completely dropped, they had to get another studio working on it. Eventually the game did come out, but it was massively delayed until very, very late in 2008. In fact, I believe it came out either in October or November of 2008. And so by the time it came out, people started playing it in a tournament scene. It was very popular when it first came out, but for whatever reason, over the course of the next year and a half, 2 years, the game died out and is no longer played in tournaments. And the question of the day is, why did this happen? So I'm going to read you what I posted on SRK, and these are my feelings about it, and I'd love to hear your feelings, especially if you played the game. I'd like to hear different perspectives, maybe people who had played Super Turbo in arcades and then played HDR and what you thought. Maybe people who had just played HDR only, never played another fighting game or another version of Street Fighter 2 before. I'd like to get all kinds of perspectives on this, but so here's what I put on SRK. I basically said, gosh, it still amazes me that this is up for debate. The first point is that HDR is not Super Turbo, okay? HDR was an attempt to make one of the longest supported Street Fighter games and update it for the modern generation, okay? Updating it. Now, why it failed, it's a straightforward answer, but it's also very confusing because of the amount of factors that were involved. So first off, what I want to say is that this game did get massive support upon release from both the hardcore Super Turbo community as well as an entirely new community of people who had never played Super Turbo or even Street Fighter 2 before in arcades. At the time of release, this game was getting entries of starting at like 50 people or more at every tournament that this game was being held at, okay? Now, if you haven't heard, this game, when it was released, actually became the highest-selling, most downloaded game ever on Xbox Live. So just put that into perspective. Out of all the games that had come out for Xbox Live, this was the most popular one ever at the time, okay? It had all the tools that it needed to succeed. It had remixed music, it had high-definition art, it had a promise of really good online play, it had a developer, David Serlin, who was a former, or actually, I don't want to say former, but I'd say former because really it's not that much of a competitive community anymore, but he was a pro Street Fighter player, a pro Super Turbo player, and he was dedicated to making rebalancing changes that everyone was going to like with this game. So the question is, what really happened here? And there's a perfectly reasonable explanation, but it really has to do with two different audiences that we have to talk about. First, there's the hardcore Super Turbo community who had played the game in arcades and had played that original version of the game and loved that version of the game. And then the new community, the HDR community, the people who had never played Street Fighter 2 before, and this was the first time they were playing it, okay? So first let's talk about the hardcore community, alright? Now, when they played the game, the more and more that they played it, they started scratching their heads with confusion. And the reason was the rebalancing changes that happened in HDR, okay? Now, some things that were promised were actually delivered on. So, for example, some of the overpowered stuff in Arcade Super Turbo, such as Original Sagat, there's a version of Sagat that's way overpowered, okay? Very easy to win with him if you just learn some basic strategies. He has very good matchups against a lot of the cast. Or maybe Vega, for example. Vega has wall dives. It's very overpowered. So that we were promised that this kind of stuff was going to be fixed. And to some extent it was. Old Sagat is a lot worse in HDR. He's completely changed. He has different properties. So that was delivered upon. But then there's other things in the game that were changed that no one can make any sense about. For example, Blanca is ranked one of the worst, if not the worst character in Arcade Super Turbo. He was actually made worse in HDR. He actually takes more damage during certain situations, and he really wasn't given any tools to be better. So the question is, what the hell happened there? And then Ken, who in Arcade Super Turbo was pretty good, but he was actually, we were told, was going to be nerfed a little bit. He was going to be made worse because he had certain things like throw loops and things like that. He actually ended up being better in HDR. And the question is, what the hell happened there? It kind of seems like there was almost like contradictory changes made. Some things were improved that were promised, but the other things were changed for no reason, and everyone was kind of like scratching their head. Now, one major point of debate is that Cammy was made so much better. Now, Cammy was one of the worst characters in Super Turbo. She had some of the worst matchups, and there was promise that, oh, she's going to be made better because one of her moves, she has this move where she does this aerial flip, and it's a throw move, okay? And it's really good, but the motion to get it out is actually difficult to do. And a lot of American players never picked Cammy because it was hard to do this move consistently, and that was pretty much one of her best moves, okay? Well, the motion was changed in HDR. What David Sterling basically did, he tried to take these moves that were harder to do in Arcade Super Turbo and give them easy inputs. And they were saying, oh, well, Cammy's going to be so much better now. Well, the bottom line is this. So what if the move's easy to do? Cammy is still ranked worldwide. She's still ranked one of the worst characters in the game. And what I want to reference here is Japan. In Japan, this game, Super Turbo, Arcade Super Turbo, was played extremely hardcore for a very long time. So every character was mastered in Japan. So if the masters of this game, who have no problems with execution, are playing Cammy and still can't win with her in a tournament setting, who cares if you make the motion easier? It's the move that's the problem. It's her moveset and her gameplay that's the problem, not the inputs of her moves. So a lot of the hardcore ST players just scratched their heads and said, wow, we really thought that these rebalance changes were going to make the game better. It looks like the game's different, but it's not necessarily better because there's these really oddball changes that we didn't even know were coming and we don't agree with, okay? Now, another major promise that was made about the game was that Akuma, who was the secret character in Arcade Super Turbo, it was his first appearance in any Street Fighter game, he was overpowered. He wasn't allowed in tournaments for Arcade Super Turbo. But we were promised that when this game came out that he would be toned down and he'd be a playable character you'd be able to play in tournaments. Well, it was funny because the very first tournament they had for HDR, Dai and I attended it. We both picked Akuma, and we raped everyone in the tournament. And then it ended up being him and me going against each other in the winner's bracket. And it was absolutely ridiculous. No one could fight Akuma. Akuma had crazy tactics like a crossover fireball trap, and as soon as he hits you once, you're completely fucked. There's no way out of it. So, again, another promise about rebalancing that was made that wasn't lived up to, and then within months of that tournament, NEC, happening, he was banned. Akuma was banned from tournament play in HDR, completely, okay? Now, there's also an issue with inputs with this game. With a game, when I say inputs, I mean there's a certain frame of time, whether it's half a millisecond, whether it's 3 milliseconds, there's a certain frame of time to do inputs to get a move to come out. So for example, if you get tripped and you're Ken, and you want to do a reversal dragon punch, you have a certain number of frames of inputs to press the button and do the motion on your controller to get that move to come out, or else it won't come out, he'll just get up normally, okay? Well, the input window for Super Turbo, Arcade Super Turbo, is one of the most strict of any fighting game ever, and I think what the developers were going for when they made HDR is they wanted to make it more open to a wider audience, so they said, let's make the inputs a lot wider, a lot easier to do. And that was made. So some moves that used to be really hard to do, you can do easily now. It's a lot easier to pull them off. Well, what I want to say here is you might call it elitist, sure, and that might be a valid point, but when you're talking about people who in the 90s grew up with Arcade Super Turbo, and it took them years to learn how to master these inputs and do these amazing reversal strategies and things like that, probably they're going to be a little bit ticked off that people who are playing HDR for the first time, within playing it for just a couple months, can do the same stuff that it took them years to master. Things that, you know, in your mind you should think are difficult to do, but they're way easier to do in this game, okay? Now, at least with Street Fighter 4, when that game came out, everyone was on an equal playing field because the game was brand new. It wasn't like you had this group of players who've been playing a harder, more difficult version of the game for 15 years, and then all of a sudden a new version came out that was easier to play. It was just easy to play from the get-go. So really people don't complain about it that much in that game because everyone's on an equal playing field. But making a remixed version of a classic game like this, where that gameplay was lauded, that gameplay is the reason why people still love the game so much, and you're dumbing it down, you might be set up to fail, at least from the hardcore gamer standpoint, okay? And I do have to say, and this might just be an issue for me, because a lot of people love the online play, but I thought the online play for this game was horrible, okay? This game, unlike other fighters, I don't know if you've played fighting games online before, but if you play a fighting game online, usually, if you have a bad connection, you can tell because everything is slowed down. It's almost like slow motion, okay? This game was the first game commercial release for a console that if there's lag, you can't tell until you're actually playing, and the game would actually take stuff back that already was displayed on your screen. So let me explain. You could jump in and do a combo, but if there's lag, all of a sudden, the game will literally skip backwards a frame and then show you what it thinks really happened. So there have been times when I jumped in and did a combo, then all of a sudden the game took it back, and I lost 40% of my life bar, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? How is this possible? How is this even acceptable in a competitive scene? So, for me, for all intents and purposes, I think the online play sucked for HDR, okay? Now, what I want to say is that from a hardcore gamer's perspective, it doesn't necessarily mean that HDR was a bad game. It just means that this game was not Arcade Super Turbo. Some people were insanely pissed that all these changes were made and the game didn't live up to what they felt it should have lived up to. Some people didn't care, they loved it, they just loved having a modern version of Super Turbo to play. And then some people didn't really care either way, and they just said, you know what, I'm just going to play it, and they went to tournaments and played the game. I was kind of in that boat. Yeah, there were changes that I didn't like. I said, you know what, who cares? I'm just going to play the game. Now, I do have to say that unfortunately at that time I wasn't really traveling and playing in a lot of tournaments, so it's not like I was going around really supporting the game heavily. I was playing it on YouTube, I was recording it, and I was putting matches up all the time. So that, at least, in that respect, I hope that I helped to promote the game. But besides that, I admit I wasn't playing it that much, okay? But the fact that there really wasn't like a boycott when this game came out. It wasn't like, upon release, all the hardcore Super Turbo players who played Arcade Super Turbo said, fuck this game, we're not playing it, boycott this game. That didn't happen. They were playing it. They were actively going around and trying to play this game in a tournament setting, and at the same time, it kind of opened up the game to an entirely new audience who had never played Street Fighter 2 before, okay? Now, I want to move on and talk about the HDR audience, meaning the people who had never played Street Fighter 2 before. But I want to check here at the time on my camera, because unfortunately I forgot to time stuff. Alright, I still got a little bit of time. I got at least 10 minutes. I don't know if I can get through all of this, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about this. So the HDR audience, the people who had never played Street Fighter 2 before. When this game came out, they actually embraced this game wholeheartedly. They really viewed it as a totally new game. They never played Arcade ST, and they said, we just want to try this. We view it as a new fighting game, okay? And again, the game was actually the most downloaded title ever on Xbox Live, which says something. And when the game was new, every tournament had some pretty decent numbers, like 50 or more entries. So the question is, what happened here in regards to this HDR community who didn't care about Arcade Super Turbo? Well, I think there's a couple things. First of all, I think a large amount of the people who bought this game on Xbox Live and PSN, they're not tournament competitors. And this is to be said for any game that comes out. There's a very, very large audience of just casual players who are never going to travel to a tournament or support the game in a tournament setting. They just want to play it at home, play some online play, and that's good enough for them. So it may not be a major factor why this game failed in a tournament setting, but at least it's worth explaining that, yeah, it might have been the most downloaded game ever, but that doesn't mean that there were that many people who went and played the game competitively, okay? Now the second factor, and this is the definitive factor about why I feel why the game died out in a tournament setting, is that this HDR community, people who had never played Arcade ST, but were playing HDR and liked it and were going to tournaments, for whatever reason they stopped going to tournaments and supporting this game. And the question is, what's the biggest factor? Why? This is a very controversial topic. People are still to this day argue about this. Why did the HDR players stop going to tournaments? And there's a whole gamut that I can go through, and I'm going to go through it of what people say the reasons for this is, okay? Number one, a lot of people say that it's because the hardcore ST players, again, the people who had played Arcade ST, were just bad-mouthing the game non-stop. They didn't like the balance changes, they said the art was ugly, they were insulting David Serlin non-stop, and yeah, I'm a little guilty of that because I've poked fun at him from time to time, but it wasn't anything that was trying to be malicious or anything like that. It was trying to be funny. And basically anything even remotely related to HDR, they say, oh, it sucks, it's not up to the quality of the perfect Arcade ST, and therefore this game sucks and no one should play it. That could probably discourage people who are trying to get this game going, or at least continuously support the game, when you have a group of people who are just shitting all over the game non-stop. So that's one factor, okay? Another one could be that maybe they just eventually realized that the game wasn't good as a tournament level game. Now, in my opinion, I don't really think that's what happened, but I still want to say it as a possibility because it could be a possibility of what happened, alright? Number three, Street Fighter 4 was released only 3 months after the release of HDR, okay? And as you know, Street Fighter 4 was giant. Media covered the game extensively. One of the best-selling games of all time for Capcom, especially from their fighter line. Still super popular to this day. And just, you know, how long? It's over 10 years in the making. That's, in my opinion, one of the largest reasons why HDR died out, because all the hype moved from one game to another, and within a year, year and a half, everyone had forgotten about HDR, everyone was playing Street Fighter 4. But That's just my opinion. There are other reasons as well. And I mean, one thing I listed here is there have been so many random conspiracy theories about what happened with HDR. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some things that I feel are red herrings and have nothing to do with it, but people still continuously to this day say that these are reasons why HDR died out. The first one is that, oh, the artwork's ugly, the artwork was bad, and it doesn't look good, it's not a visual appealing game, okay? Who fucking cares? The bottom line is this: when it comes to fighting games, in a competitive setting and in the competitive tournament scene, it's about the gameplay, not about the visuals. And a point here is that there are plenty of people who really don't like anime that much, but they actually play games like Guilty Gear and BlazBlue. They play those games in a tournament setting because they love the gameplay. And competitive players, it's been proven time and time again, will play any game, even if it looks like it's made with fucking pixelized stick figures, if the gameplay is on par. So, regardless of what the game looks like, that's a red herring. It has nothing to do with why people stop playing HDR, okay? Another point, and this is one that's said a lot, is that David Sirlin, who was the primary developer of this game, was a pretentious douchebag who didn't listen to anyone when he was making the game. And he just made whatever changes he wanted, and his changes were crazy changes, and people just don't like David Sirlin, and that's why people stop playing HDR, alright? Bullshit, alright? Even if it's true, even if there are people who don't like him, even if he really is a jerk, which I don't know really what happened during the course of the development of the game, that doesn't matter, okay? The bottom line is if a game is worthy of being played, people are going to play it, and no one's going to care who made the game, because you're too busy fucking playing the game and enjoying it. I'm sure there's been games before that the people who made the game were real jerks, but we love the game and we don't give a fuck about it, you know? So, if anything, the only people who that might have been a factor to was a small percentage of the hardcore Super Turbo audience who had played Arcade Super Turbo. They're purists. Nothing is good unless it really lives up to Arcade Super Turbo. Maybe a couple people were like that, but that's not why people just stopped playing the game, because they didn't like the developer on a personal level. That's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous cop-out, okay? Another reason people say that people stopped playing HDR is because the game was too easy to play and it wasn't tournament worthy, okay? Okay, again, for the hardcore SD audience, maybe that was a factor. But look at Street Fighter 4. Street Fighter 4 is very easy to play. Most people can sit down and play Street Fighter 4 for a couple of months against people, and they learn really basic strategies. They can do pretty decent combos. It's not that hard of a game to learn. Now, to play it on a super high tier level in a tournament, that's a whole other can of worms. But just to learn the game, it's not that hard. So the question is, why is a game like Street Fighter 4, which is easy to learn and play, so popular? Why has there been 2 expansions since the game came out? One that just came out and everyone's buying it again. When with this game, it's the same case, easier to play, everything's dumbed down, but all of a sudden people stop playing it. I don't think it has to be that the gameplay was too easy. I don't think that's what it was, okay? Another thing that people say is that the game never had a Japanese release. It's true, the game never came out in Japan, and as you know, Japan is the home of Street Fighter. You know, the most serious tournament players in the world usually come from Japan. And so people say, oh, it never came out in Japan, it only came out in America and Europe, so how could this be good when the best players in the world never even really played it? Well, guess what? Bullshit. That's another bullshit reason, because the bottom line is, number one, a small handful of players, regardless of how good they are, don't make a major amount of people play a game, okay? Sure, it might be cool to watch them play games on YouTube. Wow, that's Tokido. Wow, that's Daigo. Yeah, okay. But just because you saw a Daigo video on YouTube it's not going to make 10,000 people run out and play the game in a tournament setting, okay? So that's a cop-out. And in addition to that, the biggest reason that that's a cop-out, and it's not true, the Japanese, when they came to the US to play in tournaments, as they do every year, they were playing HDR. They were entering HDR and playing it. So that's complete nonsense. They weren't even playing the game at home, but they would come and still play it here. So that's not a reason. And then the final reason is that people say, well, the game just didn't have the support of the hardcore Super Turbo community, that's why it died. In my opinion, the game didn't need the support of the hardcore Super Turbo community. The first question is, how many of the hardcore players who have played Arcade Super Turbo are still traveling to just play Super Turbo? Let's face it, there's not a hell of a lot of them. Maybe 12, maybe 20 tops. Even me, I'm one of them, and I don't do it that much anymore. I do it every once in a while. So, no, 20 people aren't going to make and break a game, okay? So, the question is, the statement is there was an HDR community outside of that old school hardcore ST community, so where the hell did it go? Now the other fact of the matter is that when the game was released for that first year and a half, a lot of the hardcore players who were so used to the old version of the game were still entering HDR tournaments. In fact, I was one of them. Like I said, I went to NEC, any other tournaments I attended, I was entering HDR. And yeah, it's true that maybe the hardcore players complained about the game, but that doesn't mean they didn't enter it. And an entry is an entry, regardless of the people bitches and moans the entire time that they're playing the game, they still entered the game. It's still a head and a seat. Okay? So I'm going to have my conclusion now, but I want to make sure that it's not... Oh god, I have to make this really quick, alright? So the bottom line is this: regardless of the fact that there was massive impact fighting between the hardcore ST community and the new HDR audience for years, if that new HDR audience had kept playing this game and getting large numbers at every single tournament under the sun, HDR would still be being played today in a tournament setting. Now maybe the complaints and the whining of the more hardcore players that the game didn't live up to their expectations or it wasn't Arcade Super Turbo did affect the mentality of the new HDR community, and I can see that happening. If you're always bad-mouthing the game that these people are trying to get into, maybe they just don't want to play it anymore. But I think a more major factor was the fact that the game came out only 3 months before the new, shiny, 3D graphic, even more relaxed inputs, super hype monster game called Street Fighter 4 came out and basically kicked HDR to the side, okay? Now whatever the reason is, the real reason at the root cause that this game isn't played in a tournament anymore, it's time to stop the fighting. It's time to stop going back and forth and finger pointing and name calling and blame letting. We can't go back in time 3 years and revive the game. What's done is done, okay? There's still plenty of positive stuff going on in the Street Fighter community. You got Street Fighter 4 as strong as ever with 2 expansions. Just had a new release for Arcade Edition. There's an Arcade Super Turbo revival right now. If you go to any major tournament or EVO qualifier, they've had Arcade ST. This is great, positive stuff happening. It's time to stop treating these 2 groups of players like 2 southern families that have been bickering for so long they can't fucking remember what the hell the original argument was about to begin with, okay? So cut the shit. Let's all move on to more positive and constructive things. HDR, unfortunately, isn't played in tournaments anymore. It is what it is. It happened, but let's all move on and let's be positive. So that's my opinion. That's my take on the subject. I'd love to hear yours. Leave a comment on this video, and we'll go from there. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, I don't usually do something like this on my DSP Street Fighter channel, but I wanted to do something different. So, I'm DSP. Thanks a lot. See you guys later.